Why Canada have the largest oil reserves in the world? Canada is known for having one of the largest oil reserves in the world, primarily due to the vast deposits of oil sands located in the country. Oil sands, also known as tar sands, are a type of unconventional petroleum deposit that contains a mixture of bitumen, a heavy, thick form of crude oil, sand, clay, and water. There are several key reasons why Canada has such significant oil reserves. Oil sands. The Athabasca oil sands in Alberta, Canada, are one of the largest known reserves of oil sands globally. These oil sands hold a massive amount of recoverable bitumen, making Canada's oil reserves substantial. Technological advancements. Technological advancements in recent years have made the extraction of oil from oil sands more feasible and economically viable. Techniques like steam-assisted gravity drainage and mining have improved the efficiency of extracting bitumen from the oil sands. Stable political environment. Canada is a politically stable country with a well-established legal framework, which attracts investment and enables the oil industry to operate reliably. Strong regulatory system. Canada has a rigorous regulatory system for the oil and gas industry, ensuring environmental protection and responsible resource development. Global demand for oil. As global energy demand continues to rise, there is a significant market for oil, making the exploitation of Canada's oil reserves economically attractive. It's important to note that oil sands extraction can be more environmentally challenging compared to conventional oil production. The extraction process requires large amounts of water, and there are concerns about greenhouse gas emissions and impacts on the local ecosystem. Canada's energy industry and policymakers continue to work on balancing economic interests with environmental sustainability. The original theoretically recoverable reserves of Venezuela are estimated at 585 billion barrels, using the historical global average ultimate recovery ratio of 45%. Although then-President Hugo Chavez stated in 2011 that Venezuela's oil reserves had overtaken Saudi Arabia's, the U.S. Energy Information Administration (IA) estimates Venezuela's remaining proved reserves as 300 billion barrels. In the West Siberian Basin, Russia's Bazhenok Shale was estimated by the EIA to contain 1,243 billion barrels of OIP, but only 75 billion barrels of technically viable reserves. Only 165 billion barrels of proven reserves were still present in Alberta as of the end of 2015, according to the AIR. However, that number only includes proved developed reserves on active producing leases. It should not be compared to recoverable or proved reserves in Venezuela or dubious, unpublished, or at-risk reserves in Saudi Arabia. It should be noted that the table's descriptions of Alberta's OIP resources include data from the AER on oil sands, bitumen carbonates, conventional oils, tight and shale oils, and natural gas liquids. These numbers do not reflect the billions of barrels of recoverable reserves and OIP that are located offshore along the St. Lawrence Basin and East Coast, in the Beaufort Sea, the Canadian Arctic Islands Archipelago, the Northwest Territories, and the Mackenzie Delta. Almost all of Canada's oil exports go to U.S. refiners. 3.3 million barrels per day, BEPT, of crude oil, or 80% of domestic output, were exported by Canada in 2021. Over 94% of those shipments went to the U.S., and 80% of them came in the form of heavy crude made in the oil sands of Western Canada. According to Figure 1, the majority of these exports were sent to Midwest refineries in Illinois and Minnesota, primarily via the Enbridge and Keystone pipeline systems, but they were also increasingly sent to Gulf Coast refineries as a result of U.S. pipeline reversals and rail transport, which improved Canadian producers' access to these refineries. Heavy crude of the oil sands variety is specifically designed to be refined at a number of significant Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries. Many in the Midwest have recently invested billions of dollars in equipment that is expressly intended to do this. Canada is the only practical supply of crude feedstock from Midwest refineries. They lack tidewater access to import crude from other suppliers or to export their finished product. Gulf Coast refiners are able to import oil by ship, but other international supplies of heavy crude, particularly in Mexico and Venezuela, have nearly completely stopped producing the fuel, making Canada a vital source. When global demand declines, what will such export patterns mean for Canada? Weaker demand and weaker prices can make Canadian oil exporters more susceptible. Canada's sales to Midwest U.S. refiners, whose products are used in the U.S., help to somewhat insulate it from global trends. However, Canada is not totally protected against declines in global demand for the following three reasons. The actual demand in the U.S. will decline. According to projections, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the country's demand for petroleum products by 4.1 million BEPT by 2035 and 2.1 million BEPT by 2030, compared to the 18.6 million BEPT of oil that the country consumed in 2021. since they do not account for California's 2035 ban on the sale of conventional light vehicles or the subsequent announcements that will come from 15 other states with identical regulatory frameworks. Those figures are probably an underestimate. Reduced U.S. demand won't definitely result in less Canadian imports. The sophisticated modern refineries that Canada exports to wouldn't probably be the first to cut production, but there will be strong pressure for such reductions. In 2021, 46% of the production of American refiners was exported, and they will be selling into a contracting international market. A tiny but growing proportion of Canadian crude travels across the Gulf Coast to markets outside the United States in flows that reach approximately 300,000 BPD in 2021. If finished, the Trans Mountain Pipeline project would increase non-American export capacity by 600,000 BPD to the Canadian West Coast. Together, those would account for 27% of all exports in 2021. That's it for today's video. Please like the video and subscribe the channel for future